Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're undertaking a massive historical breakdown, focusing on the fascinating events of Chapter 6, Meeting the Distant Threat. Now, we so often focus on the brilliant tactics and those sweeping campaigns of Alexander the Great, right? But to truly understand his legendary status, we kind of have to shift our gaze. We need to look away from the young conqueror for just a minute and examine the colossal, sprawling superpower he was actually preparing to dismantle, the Achaemenid Persian Empire.
Okay, so let's dive into this with a massive question. Imagine for a second standing in the shoes of the young Macedonian king. How on earth do you decide to conquer the absolute largest, most formidable empire the ancient world had ever seen? Honestly, it seems like an impossible target. It's an absolute Goliath just waiting to crush a tiny upstart nation. But as you'll see, Alexander wasn't exactly flying blind or just throwing rocks at a giant.
To truly understand the scale of this Goliath, we've got to look at the numbers. The Persian Empire wasn't just a country, it was practically a continent unto itself. It stretched a mind-boggling 2,500 miles wide. Just think about that. That is an unbroken landmass extending all the way from the western edges of Anatolia, bordering the Aegean Sea, right across the Middle East, and deep into the rugged Hindu Kush Mountains in the east. It was basically a logistical nightmare and a total administrative marvel, all rolled into one.
Now, a colossal entity like this certainly doesn't just form overnight, It was forged in the mid-6th century BC by Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus was a visionary. He managed to unite various Indo-European tribes, but he didn't just conquer them, he absorbed them. He took these massive, already established kingdoms like Media and Lydia, defeated their armies, and then systematically folded their territories right into his rapidly expanding borders. He was literally laying the foundation for a true superpower.
And that relentless expansion? It definitely didn't stop there. Cyrus's successor, Cambyses, wasn't content with just Anatolia and the Near East. No, he ruthlessly marched the empire's borders south, crossing unforgiving deserts just to absorb the ancient and incredibly wealthy kingdom of Egypt. In what feels like a staggeringly short amount of time, the Persians had swallowed up almost every single major power center of the ancient world.
Then, the baton was passed to Darius I, who pushed the boundaries even further. He looked east, expanding the frontier all the way toward the Indus River. By this point, the Achaemenid kings had created this multicultural empire of unprecedented size. It was this vast patchwork of hundreds of different ethnicities, languages, and religions, all theoretically bowing to one single great king. But here is what's truly staggering about the empire's core: the sheer population density. We estimate that millions upon millions of diverse people lived under Persian rule. To put that into perspective, individual cities within the empire, like the legendary Babylon, boasted over 50,000 residents. In the ancient world, a densely packed urban center of that magnitude was an absolute powerhouse of economic and cultural activity. Which brings us to a really massive logistical problem. How do you rule a superpower this big, spread across 2,500 miles, without modern communication, and actually keep it from fracturing? Well, the Persian solution was to deploy satraps. A satrap was essentially a provincial governor. The title literally translates to protector of the province. These were incredibly powerful local elites who pledged their direct personal loyalty to the Persian king and acted as his proxy. So these satraps operated under a highly pragmatic three-step system. First, they generally allowed local cultural and religious traditions to remain completely intact. They didn't try to force assimilation. Second, in exchange for all that freedom, they collected incredibly heavy taxes to funnel straight back to the royal capitals. And third, they were required to maintain local military levies, essentially raising regional armies that the king could call upon. I mean, it sounds like a perfect system of delegation, right? But that brings us to our next major point: rebellions and fatal flaws. Because as it turns out, that exact setup was a massive double-edged sword. This decentralized system, giving extreme military and financial power to distant governors, became a chronic disease. It literally began rotting the empire from the inside out. Distant satrapies on the absolute edges of the empire, like Egypt down south, and the Ionian Greek cities over on the Aegean coast, well, they were in almost constant revolt. Since the satraps had their own local armies and their own local wealth, they constantly tested the king. Persian monarchs were forced into these exhausting, endlessly expensive campaigns just to keep the map intact.
And if the edges were fraying, the core was even worse: blood on the throne. While those outer borders were bleeding resources dry, the heart of the empire was suffering from violent chaos that reads like a dark political thriller. Just look at the level of betrayal stacking up here. In 465 BC, King Xerxes is murdered by his own guard. Jump to 424 BC, King Sogdianus is murdered by his half-brother Ochus. By the 330s, the royal court is effectively being puppeted by a palace eunuch named Bagoas. He poisons King Artaxerxes III, puts his son Arses on the throne, and then poisons him too. It's an overwhelming, vicious cycle of brothers murdering brothers and insiders assassinating kings, completely destroying any sense of central stability.
The internal rot was so theatrical that it led to this absolutely incredible historical moment. After assassinating 2 kings in a row, the infamous eunuch Bagos tried his trick a 3rd time on the newly installed King Darius III. But Darius was warned. He completely outmaneuvered the assassin, and, in a poetic twist of fate, Bagos was forced to drink the very poisoned cup he had prepared for the king. You literally can't make this stuff up, but it highlights a terrifying truth. The Persian leadership was entirely consumed by survival, not strategy. Which leads us perfectly into why Alexander attacked. Because when you understand the sheer dysfunction of the Persian court, Alexander's invasion suddenly looks very, very different. He wasn't blindly throwing his men at an invincible giant at all. He was tactically striking a deeply fragmented, highly vulnerable target, and he knew exactly how they managed their wealth. He knew the Persians relied on vast, stationary hoards of treasure, stockpiling an estimated 50,000 talents of silver. That is an absolutely unimaginable, world-altering fortune in the ancient world. But rather than investing that wealth into developing a unified, modernized military strategy, they just sat on it. The stark contrast between these two forces is exactly where the war was won. Alexander had inherited a unified, highly trained standing army built by his father, Philip. We're talking about 40,000 elite infantry and 5,000 cavalry operating as a single devastating machine. Persia, on the other hand, they had to rely on a decentralized mess of massive local levies dragged from those distant satrapies, supplemented by Greek mercenaries. The Macedonian phalanx was perfectly designed to just slice right through disorganized multilingual levies who barely even knew the commanders leading them.
Plus, Alexander definitely wasn't marching in blind. Utilizing decades of Greek historical accounts, like the writings of Herodotus, and deep intelligence gathered by Macedonian scouts, he knew the map. He perfectly understood the rugged, mountainous terrain of the frontier, and more importantly, he understood the deep political fractures and resentments of the local populations he was walking right into.
So his invasion was really a masterpiece of calculation and opportunism, driven by incredibly clear, distinct goals. First, he needed to avenge the historical Persian invasions of Greece to win political favor back home. Next, he needed to preempt any Persian interference in his newly formed kingdom. Third, he wanted to liberate the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor. And finally, frankly, he had a massive, highly trained, extremely restless standing army that he needed to put to work before they turned on him.
So, armed with the perfect army, flawless intelligence, a clear set of motives, and an enemy that was actively tearing itself apart from the inside, Alexander moved in for the kill. He didn't just want to win some minor border dispute. He intended to dismantle the entire Achaemenid structure completely, absorbing that whole 2,500-mile expanse into his own empire.
Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Looking back at all the evidence, was Alexander truly a noble liberator of the world, bringing Hellenic enlightenment to an oppressed people? Or was he simply a brilliant, ruthless predator exploiting a wounded, dying giant at the absolute perfect moment in history? It's a question historians still debate today, and I hope this deep dive into the distant threat of the Persian Empire has given you the context to decide for yourself.